Who makes history? Great men. Or if you want to put it in a somewhat less crass way, let's quote the Scottish writer Thomas Carlyle. In all epochs of the world's history, we shall find the great man to have been the indispensable savior of his epoch, the lightning without which the fuel never would have been burnt. The history of the world was the biography of great men. So Carlyle said in a lecture that was eventually published under the title On Heroes, Hero Worship, and the Heroic in History in 1841. And that's kind of how the study of history is often worked. Shuffling through a progression of dead, usually white, kings, presidents, and generals, all of whom were supposedly so remarkable that they were able to mold the course of events through sheer will.
It's the unspoken truth of humanity that you crave subjugation. You were made to be ruled. In the end, you will always kneel.
Not to men like you.
There are no men like me.
There are always men like you.
But is that really true? Are everyday Joes really so insignificant? Do women, people of color, and the disabled really have so little impact on what happens? Or is the history of great men just BS? Let's discuss it. Greetings, I'm Dr. Doug Campbell, and let's kick the tires on this so-called history of great men. As we said, Thomas Carlyle is the name most associated with this particular approach to history. In his book, he looked at various examples of geniuses who had impacted history and gave examples of each. From the prophets, such as Muhammad, to the poets, Dante and Shakespeare, to the priests, Martin Luther and John Knox, to men of letters, Samuel Johnson, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Robert Burns, to kings, Oliver Cromwell, Napoleon Bonaparte. Through all of these examples, Carlyle argued that the way events unfolded was decisively impacted by the efforts of these exceptional men. He even somewhat awkwardly threw in the Nordic god Odin as an example of this notion as well. Carlyle may be the most prominent example of so-called great man history, but it's been a remarkably durable approach throughout the ages, going back many centuries. Homer boiled down the story of the Trojan War into a conflict between great personalities such as Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus, Hector, and Priam. Likewise, the Hebrew Bible's narrative focuses on patriarchs, prophets, and kings such as Abraham, Moses, David, and Isaiah. The 2nd century Greek historian Plutarch offered his parallel lives of noble Greeks and Romans to emphasize the importance of virtue in the character of elite figures such as Lycurgus, Pericles, Alexander, Cato, Cicero, and Caesar. Even Shakespeare's historical plays tend to emphasize the impact of great characters such as Richard III, Henry Bolingbroke, and Prince Hal over their less socially elevated associates. And in many ways, this method of approaching the past makes a lot of intuitive sense. As humans, we are all individual personalities, and most of our experience consists of dealing with other individuals on a daily basis. So it seems a natural assumption that the study of history ought also to focus on individual personalities, even if they would have to be pretty extraordinary in order to impact the broader course of events in such a decisive way.
Do you know how much I make a year? I mean, even if I told you, you wouldn't believe it. Do you know what would happen if I suddenly decided to stop going into work? A business big enough that it could be listed on the NASDAQ goes belly up. Disappears. It ceases to exist without me. No, you clearly don't know who you're talking to, so let me clue you in. I am not in danger, Skylar. I am the danger. A guy opens his door and gets shot, and you think that of me? No. I I am the one who knocks.
While such a vision of history is undoubtedly flattering to the people we call great men, it is certainly worth asking whether it overstates the importance of these big shots. Generals love to claim credit for their wartime victories, but isn't it really the rank-and-file soldiers who spill and shed blood in order to secure the triumph? A king might claim to be the father of his subjects, but who is it who really makes his kingdom? Is it him? Or is it them? A president might claim to lead his country, but where would he be without the voters who elected him or the taxpayers who provide him with the revenue to enact his policies? At the end of the day, there are always more everyday folks and common people than there are so-called great men. So perhaps they are the ones who are the appropriate focus of history, rather than the big shots. This is where history from below, or alternately, people's history, came in. There have been some writers who focused on everyday experience throughout the centuries, but this approach truly came into its own in the 20th century, particularly in the socially tumultuous decades of the 1930s and the 1960s. A.I. Morton's A People's History of England, E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, and Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States each found broad popularity even as they foregrounded the impact of ordinary people on the course of history.
Hobbits have been living and farming in the Four Farthings of the Shire for many hundreds of years, quite content to ignore and be ignored by the world of the big folk. Hobbits must seem of little importance, being neither renowned as great warriors nor counted among the very wise.
Originally, the focus was on white men from lower social classes, but very quickly the practitioners of history from below moved to write histories of women, of racial minorities, of indigenous peoples of conquered regions, and of LGBTQ+ people. Excluded groups such as criminals, prostitutes, and the disabled took their place alongside generals, presidents, and popes as appropriate objects of historical inquiry.
You crashed your jet ski into a manatee?
Yeah, I'm from Jacksonville, Florida. It happens a lot.
And certainly this approach does provide a very different perspective from great man history. Take, for example, Villains of All Nations, the 2004 book by the University of Pittsburgh historian and activist Marcus Rediker, which examines Atlantic piracy in the 18th century, rather than the, quote, common enemy of mankind, as pirates were often characterized by governments and wealthy businessmen. Rediker finds that they were often deliberate outlaws who came from the lower ranks of society and who forged multinational and democratic communities outside the legal structures which had previously exploited them. Those who the elite saw as villains appeared as radically egalitarian free thinkers when viewed through the lens of history from below.
On the high seas, your ship attacked. The dread pirate Roberts never takes prisoners.
I can't afford to make exceptions. I mean, once word leaks out that a pirate has gone soft, people begin to disobey you, and then it's nothing but work, work, work all the time.
You mock my pain.
Life is pain, Highness. Anyone who says differently is selling something.
As always, who the good guys really are depends very much on the perspective you take and whether you're viewing things from the point of view of a cop or of an outlaw.
Luke, you're going to find that many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view.
Likewise, if we turn our gaze to women, Joan Kelly's 1976 essay, Did Women Have a Renaissance?, examined the extent to which the periodization devised for the privileged men who ruled Europe really made sense for women living in that same society. Kelly concluded that the sorts of changes characteristic of the Renaissance, that is to say, an expansion of the range of political, economic, and social choices which were available to men living at that time, were actually denied to women, whose lives during the same era indeed generally saw a narrowing of options. Kelly noted that the precise nature of the bargain varied according to social class, as aristocratic, bourgeois, and lower-class women lived significantly different lives from one another. Ultimately, however, in all cases, she argued that there really was no renaissance for women in the way that there was for men. Once again, it's all a matter of perspective. Finally, on the other side of the Atlantic, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States from 2014 provided another contrast to great man history. Instead of a triumphalist narrative of American expansion into a virgin western wilderness, in which supposedly savage Indians were destined to disappear when confronted with white civilization, Dunbar Ortiz tells the story of native resistance and survival in the face of a ruthless invasion. In contrast to Abraham Lincoln's Homestead Act of 1862, giving away allegedly uninhabited land, Dunbar Ortiz presents the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, in which U.S. soldiers murdered hundreds of Cheyenne and Arapaho people, in clear violation of previous territorial guarantees. The incursion prompted what became known as Red Cloud's War, in which an alliance of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people managed to drive back invaders from the United States for the better part of a decade. Ultimately, Dunbar Ortiz foregrounds indigenous Americans as the protagonists of her narrative, emphasizing resistance and survival in the face of brutal assaults by soldiers and settlers from the United States. These sorts of histories from below enrich our understanding of the human past by focusing on groups too often neglected in traditional accounts. They also pointedly ask questions about who the appropriate protagonists of history really are. After all, we all assume that we're the good guys in any story which might be told about our lives. We think that we are all the main characters of our own personal movies, and yet we all have different perspectives on events, whether large or small. Surely it can only enhance our understanding of the past to examine as many of these perspectives as possible. Indeed, if we truly seek to understand the larger outlines of the human past, perhaps we need to transcend the perspectives of all individuals, whether great or small, quote unquote. Perhaps we need to zoom out and focus on the larger structures of human societies. To this end, we can look at examinations of so-called longue durée, French for long durations, of the Annales school in the mid-20th century.
And I love French wine, like I love the French language. I have sampled every language. French is my favorite, fantastic language. Especially to curse with. Nom de Dieu, de putain de bordel de merde, de saloperie, de connard, d'enculé de ta mère. It's like wiping your ass with silk. I love it.
This approach, most famously exemplified by Fernand Braudel's 1949 book, The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in the Age of Philip II, sought to examine structures and mentalities which endured in societies across many centuries. In such an approach to history, individual efforts can move the needle of change only minutely, while the broader human social systems were far more durable, recognizably persisting generation after generation. Emanuel Wallerstein similarly proposed the idea of world systems as a means of understanding the past half-millennium of human history. Again, rather than examining the intentional acts of individual people, he looked at the outlines of vast networks of economic and political power which transcended even the boundaries of individual countries, linking prosperous core regions to more peripheral zones. This conception of history can seem a bit impersonal, but it certainly has a lot of explanatory value. After all, if one is examining people navigating a labyrinth, it is certainly important to look at individual decisions and why people turn right or left. But it is also just as critical to look at the shape of the maze which limits the scope of individual decision-making. This is particularly true if that shape is continually changing and evolving even as people are trying to make their way through the many twists and turns.
I have to solve this labyrinth, but there aren't any turns or any openings or anything. It just goes on and on and...
Well, you ain't looking right. It's full of openings. It's just you ain't seeing them.
Well, where are they?
There's one just across there. It's right in front of you.
That's just wall. There's no way through.
Things are not always what they seem in this place. So, you can't take anything for granted.
Hey!
The structures of power, wealth, and privilege are the labyrinth through which people wander throughout history. We also might note that both the practitioners of people's history and the histories of larger social structures tend to take a radical and critical stance when discussing the capitalist system, which has been so dominant in the modern era. So is history from below a politically leftist concept? In many ways, yeah, sure. More conservative visions of history have indeed tended to focus on great men, reinforcing traditional hierarchies of wealth, power, and gender, arguing that people generally get what they deserve in life. According to this view, if certain men have attained positions of privilege and influence, it is precisely because those men are great. They deserve it. By generally focusing on people without wealth and power, history from below necessarily de-emphasizes traditional hierarchies, portraying them as arbitrary and contingent, rather than natural and essential parts of human life.
It's a made-up tale. It's a total fabrication. It's a fake. It's fiction.
In that sense, there's no getting around it. Both people's history and great man history are both inherently political approaches which are diametrically opposed. Generally in these videos, I tend to do a list of recommended readings, but this is sort of what the video has been about. So just to recap real quick, some of the major books I've mentioned. Thomas Carlyle, On Heroes, Hero Worship and the Heroic in History, 1841. Plutarch's Parallel Lives. E.P. Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class, 1968. Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States, 2005. Marcus Rediker, Villains of All Nations, Atlantic Pirates in the Golden Age, 2004. Joan Kelly's essay, Did Women Have a Renaissance?, appears in the collection of her works Women, History and Theory, The Essays of Joan Kelly from 1984. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, 2014. Fernand Braudel, The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in the Age of Philip II, 1949. And finally, Emanuel Wallerstein, World Systems Analysis, An Introduction, 2004. So as always, let's wrap up with our verdict. Is the history of great men BS? On a certain level, obviously not. Individuals with power, wealth, and privilege clearly have played significant roles in the history of our species. It seems difficult to imagine that one could understand the human past without knowing about people like Muhammad, or Shakespeare, or Napoleon. We instinctively think in terms of individual experience, and it seems doubtful that biographies of kings, presidents, or generals are going to disappear from the shelves anytime soon. On the other hand, however, surely the picture has got to be incomplete if we solely focus on great men. Both human social structures and everyday people are undoubtedly just as crucial to understanding our past. We need to look at the outlines of the maze as well as the people making their way through it. We need to acknowledge that ordinary people also have an important impact on the course of events. If we only look at a small part of the story, we'll surely be left with history so incomplete as to be, well, yes, BS. So perhaps ironically, let me close with a quote from one of Carlyle's great men, Robert Burns, who probably would have been appalled to learn that he had been elevated by another author, and indeed another Scotsman to boot, above the common folk that he celebrated so frequently in his poetry.
Brothers and sisters are natural enemies, like Englishmen and Scots, or Welshmen and Scots, or Japanese and Scots, or Scots and other Scots. Damn Scots! They ruined Scotland!
You Scots sure are a contentious people.
You just made an enemy for life!
So, these are some excerpts from his poem, For All That and All That, from 1795. Is there for honest poverty that hangs his head and all that? The coward slave we pass him by, we dare be poor for all that. For all that and all that, our toils obscure and all that. The rank is but the guinea's stamp, the man's the gold for all that. A prince can make a belted knight, a marquis, duke, and all that. But an honest man's aboon his might, good faith he maun afoul that. For all that and all that, their dignities and all that, the pith o' sense and pride o' worth are higher rank than all that. Then let us pray that come it may, and come it will for all that sense and worth o'er all the earth shall bear the gree and all that. For all that and all that, it's coming yet for all that man to man the world o'er shall brothers be for all that. That's all I got for you. Always check your sources and evidence. See you later.